Okay, good morning, Dad.
Good morning.
Today is Monday, July 7th, and what's the big story out there today?
The big story out there today. No, I don't really know. You're going to have to tell me. I'm sorry.
Well, I don't know if we want to talk about it, but Musk announced the formation of his
Oh,
new party, the America Party or American Party, I'm not sure, but is that anything groundbreaking or we'll just have to kind of watch and see what happens if it
y-
actually turns into something, right?
right. Yeah. It has. It's just an idea, just a notion. Of course, it's a notion with billions of dollars behind it because it's Musk who said it. So we have to pay attention. Third parties just never seem to go anywhere in the U.S. The two-party system hasn't. Well, the current one, the Republicans and the Democrats, that just goes all the way back to basically the Civil War. So, we're talking well over a century, about 150 years more. Um, and yeah, but systems that seem to last like ever, forever, like empires, you start to think that they will never fall. Eventually, they do. They all do. So we'll see. Maybe it'll turn into something.
Yeah, I feel like the better strategy is just to wait for the inevitable collapse and then try to party. I just would hate to be in politics now. I mean, it just feels like we're playing this game of hot potato and just waiting for it to go off on any
Uh huh.
president. So even if Musk does have some great ideas and wants to reform everything, I feel like it's a little bit too late. You're going to be stuck with such a rotten mess. It's going to blow up on your hands, and everyone's like, "Man, that American Party was stupid."
Right. Yeah. Wait for the hot potato to I don't know, burn some hands first,
Yeah,
or
I
the
don't know what
can
that
that's been
potato is
kicked,
supposed to
yeah,
do.
or the can that's been kicked down the road to eventually go off the cliff, or whatever it is. Whatever metaphor you want to use.
Right. Okay, well, we don't have to talk about that.
Okay.
We can. I want to talk a little bit more about Iran and Israel. It's been about 2 weeks or so since the end of the 12-day war. Do we have a clearer picture now on the damage done, the economic and societal damage to both Israel and Iran?
Um, well, okay, some of the things that we had heard of, actually from Iran have been confirmed. I believe it was like the Oregon State University did a study of satellite photos of military installations in Israel and found that, was it five or six military installations had been struck by Iran. Now, I don't
Yeah, I
know
heard
whether
five.
five, okay. Yeah, I don't know exactly how much damage was done. Now, this was, not admitted to by Israel. We've talked about um, uh, Israeli censorship. Military censorship is actually very, very severe, and so it was just not mentioned in any other news reports. But the Iranians said it, and it turns out the Iranians were right. Now, we don't know the extent of the damage. Again, the IDF is just not saying anything. They said is that operations continued at these places throughout the war. But the fact that they didn't say, oh, it was just minimal damage, suggests to me that there may have been some very significant damage. Um, so that we know, as for the total economic costs, and um, yeah, I haven't seen a figure attached to it. But it's clear. It's just the okay the partial blocking of the port, in Haifa. The Maersk line stopped operating there. The shutdown of their only international airport. Uh, all that right there had to have a huge effect. And then just long term, the fact that Tel Aviv was and these other cities, all the cities, major cities in Israel were hit and suffered significant damage. This is something that's just never happened to Israel before, even during the Yom Kippur War, where that was one of the toughest wars that Israel fought. They were actually on, we're talking about 1972, 1973. I can't remember which year it was exactly, but the Egyptian and Syrian armies actually launched a surprise attack after suffering a surprise attack in 1967 and had Israel on the back foot. But just thanks to the U.S., and a airlift of a huge amount of supplies, the Israelis were able to turn the tide. But even in that war, the cities weren't damaged. So this is a first. This is something, and this is again, um, it certainly has to have affected the Israeli psyche. I think it will anyway. I've been reading the articles in Haaretz, which again is the left-wing paper there in Israel, very carefully. And they're not really, with maybe one exception, they're just not admitting to that. It's just sort of like, oh, this is a tremendous victory. It's kind of like, this is, the war against Iran was supported across the spectrum. And, even the left-wing Israelis, some of them who are, in fact, some of them, it's a small minority, but some of them are sympathetic to the Palestinians and are substantively, meaningfully critical of, the Gaza war and other policies vis-a-vis the Palestinians. But you just don't see that same kind of dissident or opposition mentality when it comes to Iran. And so they seem to be on the page. They've accepted like everything that their government has told them, that this was a tremendous victory. Now, I just wonder if over time that's going to wear away, because I mean, that there is just the fact of the damage that you can't hide. It's going to take a while to repair these places. And some of them, like that, the Weizmann Institute, the Scientific Research Institute, my understanding is this leading institute in Israel. A lot of really cutting edge research was done there, and that place was destroyed. It wasn't just damaged. That's a major loss, to Israel. So I'm not sure, how it's really affected the Israeli psyche, but it certainly has affected the way other people look at Israel, including potential investors, and that has economic consequences, as we've said before. Now, in Iran, I don't know. It's harder to get information. We don't know the extent of the damage that was done there. We know there were many people killed. That there's no question about that. I think I have reports from like 500 to 1,000, and the vast majority of whom were civilians. Even if the target was military or often civilian when we're talking about civilian nuclear scientists. But when the Israelis attacked these people, they also killed their families and sometimes killed many dozens or many families within the apartment building where these people were staying. So it's still a kind of a mystery to me, like how much of Iran's, let's say, military infrastructure, in particular its missile infrastructure, its launchers, and maybe factories and so on. It's something that clearly the Israelis were going after, and they claim to have had great success. Maybe they did, but it's unclear. And I think that's actually a really big question mark, and it will. We may only learn if when this conflict starts up again, if indeed it does, and probably it will. We'll see how much of a missile infrastructure the Iranians still have.
Yeah, it seems to be that we're still in a bit of a fog of war. There's still pretty heavy censorship on the Israeli side of the damage done. They're still champing everything down.
Right. Well, especially with in general, there would be actually, they can't hide what happened in the cities. Everybody sees it. It was filmed. Even if it wasn't supposed to be, the people, everybody's got a phone, and so we all saw the videos, and they just can't hide that. But even so, okay. But when it comes to the military sites, it's just been a total blackout. They didn't admit to anything. Then because of this OSU analysis, they were forced to admit that it happened, but they didn't say anything really about the extent of the damage. Now, they've also come out with reports. The IDF has claimed that they shot down 86% of incoming missiles. And, that might be true. We really don't know. Yeah, it's just the IDF does have a history of lying about things like this. Like during the first Gulf War back in the early 90s, quite 100 or more Scud missiles were launched from Iraq into Israel. and the Israelis claimed to have shot them all down, and it turned out to, or very close to that, and it turned out to be total bunk. I don't think they shot any of them down. I mean, if they didn't do very much damage, they weren't very sophisticated missiles, much less sophisticated and powerful than the Iranian missiles, but they actually did get through, and the IDF lied about that. So there's no reason to assume they're telling the truth now. Now, they just might be, maybe they did get 86%, but that 86%, how many of them were essentially decoys, old missiles or even decoy missiles or drones that the Iranians had sent? We don't know.
Yeah, I hear, I think it might have been even Colonel Douglas McGregor saying that a third of Tel Aviv was damaged or destroyed. You hear these reports, but you would see the evidence of that, right? I mean, right. I know Tel Aviv got hit. We know some big buildings were damaged, but right.
The
extent of the damage, I felt like we would be able to see more come out on social media.
Right. I don't think you can hide that. So that seems to me like an exaggeration. I did, just from those videos that I saw, you could see that even in downtown Tel Aviv, major damage was done. You can see a couple of blocks that were severely damaged. And then I think I saw another one. It was right outside of Tel Aviv or on the edge of Tel Aviv, where several blocks, were just pretty much wiped out. So there was significant damage, but I don't think it would come anywhere close to a third.
Yeah, and it also could be how you define it, like, some windows got cracks in them.
Yeah,
it's like, right. Does that count?
But I mean, even if 1%, that's actually very significant damage. And that 1%, for every 1% of the buildings that were damaged or destroyed, there are all these people around there, and they all know about it. I mean, it affects them.
So it was, you said Oregon State University that did the study and got satellite images? How does that work? Do we just have to hope that just some university, some professors like, I'm going to look into this? I mean, we should be able to have more access, right? Like satellite. The U.S. has tons of satellites, right?
Yeah.
But I guess they don't want to show.
Right. I'm not sure why that is. Well, of course, our intelligence agencies probably, do all this work, but they don't release the information unless they want to. I'm not, maybe OSU has a very advanced, satellite analysis, research group there or something. I just don't know. I can't answer that.
Yeah, I'm interesting because Oregon State, the Beavers, I didn't think that they would have. I didn't think they would have it. Well, I feel. Do you hear much about how the Israelis are feeling, just politically, society-wise? Just because I feel like things have to be getting tough for them. I mean, just being the most hated country in the world, and it's intensifying as they're trying to fight their way out of this by just continuing to bomb Gaza. We're seeing them increasing strikes in Lebanon, increasing activities in the West Bank, start this Operation Black Flag now in Yemen. I think we just, we're hearing more and more chants, death to the IDF, people waving Palestinian flags. Like, what kind of effect is this having on Israeli society? I mean, if they get on a plane and travel anywhere, they have to be hiding their the fact that they're Israeli.
Yeah, well, it's again, based on what I'm seeing in Haaretz, and Haaretz again is the left-wing one where you'd find more dissident, you think you'd find more dissident points of view and more introspection. I'm really not seeing that. There seems to be, again, vis-a-vis Iran, there seems to be a certain amount of triumphalism and optimism, and it clearly has helped in the short term. It has helped Netanyahu without a doubt. I mean, it has given him a bump in the polls, but those things, they're short-lived. I mean, and I think again the permanent damage has been done and continues to expand. I mean, just the damage to their reputation, to their moral standing, that hasn't ebbed away in anything. The war is only made their position worse. I think there's no question. That's just objectively true. So subjectively, I think they're actually in a rather optimistic state of mind. But that emotion that's connected with the war and their own interpretation of it, the way that I think the war was presented to them, in part thanks to military censorship there, has given them a sense that they achieved a great victory, and that this rival of theirs, their great enemy, has been suffered a serious defeat. But that's all going to fade away, and the problems that you described are going to be no less, but in fact are going to be worse when they kind of wake up to that reality. So I think you just get sort of a siege mentality. Increasingly, it's just like, yeah, the world hates us because they're all anti-Semitic, but it doesn't matter because we're just so incredible and we have the U.S. at our back.
Are you really sure that they have a sense of triumphalism after this 12-day war, or is that something that maybe that they're trying to put out there to project that image? But
Yeah.
I feel like Israelis have to realize that this isn't a victory. They didn't get a regime change. Iran is still
Yeah.
standing. They're more unified now more than ever before. And Israelis know that they are the ones that asked for the ceasefire, right? Are they aware of
Yeah.
that?
Yeah, the story is, well, we achieved our objectives. Again, I have, maybe seen one exception to that. I have, all these things that you point out, their objectives weren't achieved. And above all, like if you really were worried about the nuclear program, you ought to be much more worried now. Before, again, it was the most intensively monitored nuclear program on the planet. Not any longer. The IAEA has been kicked out for obvious reasons. And now you have a country that has a real reason that had never, well, at least since, before 2003, had never had any interest in developing a nuclear weapon. And that has been verified again and again, even by the Mossad, but certainly by U.S. intelligence, year after year after year after year. And now, that's thrown into doubt. I mean, if the whole question of nuclear weapons in Iran was what really caused you anxiety, well, you should be much more anxious now than afterwards. And then, yeah, if you wanted to achieve a regime change, again, objectively they failed, and I haven't seen anybody suggest that this has had any success. So this regime change attempt had any success whatsoever. In fact, everybody, including Western media, for example, The Economist, says that there has been a tremendous rally around the flag effect, and that everybody has become basically a hardliner within Iran. So these are your two main measures, and obviously you failed. But I just don't see that objective analysis. Maybe it's military censorship, or maybe it's just sort of they're in the grips of certain kind of emotion, a feeling of relief that the war is over, and they're trying to, it's a case of self-deception. I don't see it, but I think eventually the reality will seep in. And again, Netanyahu is playing it up, for all it's worth. And I think maybe like the other political leaders feel like they have to play along with them. So it's just like that's the narrative that the Israeli public is being fed, and by and large they seem to be buying it. But I think, again, reality has a way of eventually winning the war, even if it can lose the battle. And at some point, I think they're going to realize that they didn't achieve anything, and their position is worse than ever.
Yeah, I think the Israeli propaganda machine is a big player in this. It's quite effective. I'll see on social media these statements or these accounts from Hasbara propagandists that are just clearly absurd. But I'm like, nobody's falling for this. But I think the method that they have is they just pump out so much propaganda, so many like fake maps and quotes and statistics and just outright lies and all these inversions, and to the point where I think people are just confused. And maybe I guess that's their strategy, just delude the English speaking world. And they know they have a compliant Zionist Western media, so they can really take this thing very far. But and they may fall victim to their own propaganda as well, because they're pumping out so much of this and feeding this and reinforcing false narratives. But it just takes you further down this road that it's going to be to the detriment of Israel, because they're not able to have that reality check, or the Western world. We can't get this reality check. It's so difficult to pierce that fog of just constant disinformation being pumped out.
Yeah, no, it is, and we've spoken about it in the context of the Ukraine war, and pointed out that yeah, in a way, we've become a victim of our own propaganda. It's become impossible to speak about things realistically. You have to kind of live within with the narrative and operate within it. And I think, yeah, it's very much the same for Israel.
Hmm. Yeah, it's hard to know what's real out there now. I mean, that's why. That's why I need you, Dad, to tell me
Yeah, well,
what's
it's tough,
what's real.
it really is. I mean, we have to be careful. Um, I think the reason that I'm part of, let's say, this alternative media ecosystem is that I've found that it's been much more reliable, that it is a reality based community, and that, by and large, we know what's going on, and when certain developments occur, usually they're not a surprise. Of course, you can't predict things like some of these, like the Operation Rising Lion. This is something that's done in the dark, and then these kind of things can take us by surprise. But the broader trends are I think we really have a clear grasp of it. That's what I find. I mean, you always have to kind of check your own sources, and and everybody's capable of mistakes. And I think occasionally, too, the alternative media will kind of latch on to a certain explanation that maybe isn't quite true. We have our own confirmation bias. Um, so it's yeah, it's a struggle to really find out the truth. I think the main thing to though is to break out from the mainstream media narrative. That's what the true disinformation is, and to get into these alternative spaces. But even there's no guarantee that everything you're getting is true. You do have to do reality checks, um, and also admit that sometimes we just really don't know what's going on. We're kind of looking at a um, shadows on the wall. We're making guesses. We hear statements from leaders and, leaks from intelligence agencies. Is this real, or is this just trying to manipulate us? We do our best to try to make sense of all this, but often we're at a disadvantage, because we don't, because the reality is being hidden from us. That's the world that we live in.
Hmm. Um, all right, I'll go back just to Iran a little bit more. Iran, have they officially left the IAEA? Have
Well, they
they
have,
kicked out?
okay, yeah, they've kicked out the inspectors. They have suspended their relationship with him, but they haven't officially ended it. I think they're holding out the possibility that they could restart this relationship, but for the present, they can't. And I don't see how they can do otherwise after what happened. The IAEA has some really serious explaining to do. There's the deal is, okay. You have this. You open up your facilities to inspection. You comply with the IAEA requirements, and seriously, Iran has has been doing that for years and years and years, and is, like I've said, is actually been subjected to many more inspections than other similar facilities in other countries. 3 times as much as the average, and yet, when first Israel and then the U.S. actually attacked these IAEA inspected facilities, they did not condemn it. That's their responsibility. Like, okay, we put ourselves on the NPT. We've opened ourselves to inspections by you. Now we're attacked in violation of the NPT. Let's remember that. It's not Iran that's violating the NPT. It's Israel and it's the U.S. And yet they could not get a condemnation. And then, and not even, I haven't even mentioned the assassination of all those civilian nuclear scientists, and their assassinations, the assassination of their families. There was never a condemnation. You just look at this. What is this organization? It's just kind of the minimal, well, decency, but also just institutional ethics. This is really what the minimum that they should do is to condemn these acts, and they did nothing. So yeah, no, obviously the IAEA needs to be reformed. Yeah, Grossi needs to go. There needs to be an apology. Say, okay, yeah, we allowed ourselves to become a tool, of Western hegemony and Zionism. Okay, here's the new IAEA. They need to reassure, somehow convince the Iranians that things are different. So there's that going on. And then also there was all this talk about, I see like every other day, there's going to be a meeting between Witkoff and Arakchi, the foreign minister of Iran, like 2 days from now or 3 days from now. And it never happens. And the Iranians have said openly, we don't know what you're talking about. So this is just clearly, it's just rumor or it's just lying by the administration. And they say the same thing, is that you need to convince us that things have changed. Last time, you used this as a cloak for actually preparing for war against them. And then you attacked us, during the negotiations just prior to the sixth round. We can't continue with this. You need to convince us, give us some sort of meaningful guarantee that this will not happen again. And they haven't received it, so there are no negotiations. That's where we are. Again, it's just like if you're Israel, if your concern really was the nuclear program, you have to admit you just made things a lot worse.
Do you see much chance that we can start negotiations, that the U.S. would make some gestures to show that it is, wants to act in good faith? Like, could it force an IAEA reform, get rid of Grossi, issue the apology? We don't issue apologies. We don't do that.
I know. That's the thing. It's like, we just don't. You're right. I'll give you an example. It was back in the 1980s. We shot down an Iranian civilian airliner that had more than 200 people aboard, killed them all, killed all the passengers, all the crew. We never, to this day, we have not issued an apology.
Why is that? Why? That's such an easy thing to...
Right. You would think so. I mean, just in the name of common decency, but it's just, there's, we're never wrong. We're all powerful. This is something that...
Is that a standard operating procedure for countries in general? Don't apologize because it makes you look weak?
Well, I guess maybe it's a standard operating procedure for powerful countries. They don't want to, like you say, it makes it, they're afraid that this makes them look weak. Weaker countries that often don't have a choice will issue apologies, So it doesn't look good. I don't see us issuing an apology. I don't see us reforming the IAEA. It's our baby. We're not going to give it up. It's been doing our bidding. So the only thing is maybe the Iranians, the reformers might cave in. Maybe Pezeshkian is just too soft or, too naive. He's displayed a fair amount of naivete in the past. But I think, he's woken up. And I think if he tried to do it, there would be an outcry within Iran. There's a great deal of anger, about what has happened. And they say, no, we're not going down this road again.
Okay, well then if there's no diplomacy, if there are no nuclear inspections, do we imagine that there'll be more of a panic that will go through the intelligence agencies in the West and just the administration, that they'll be like, oh, we really messed up and now, we want to talk to Iran and they won't talk to us? And that what do you think is going to be the next fuse when they actually leave the NPT? Because it sounds like this is where it's all going, right? There's an eventual departure from the NPT. And when that happens, is that the fuse that will ignite this war again?
It could. I don't know that they're going to leave the NPT. I don't know that they're going to go for a nuclear weapon. I don't think
they will, to be honest. I believe that fatwa. I don't, right. I really believe the Iranians. Maybe I'm being naive and stupid too, but so far, everything that I hear, the impression I get from Iran is when they say something, they actually mean it. They hold to their word, and I think they take that religious decree quite seriously. I mean, that's something you could say about people that are quite zealous religiously, that that they take that seriously.
Yeah, well, clearly they have. I talked about the Iraq war and chemical weapons, and they suffered terribly, under these chemical attacks, but they fought what was never lifted. There was pressure to do it. There's been pressure on Khamenei to lift this fatwa even prior to the recent attack, and I'm sure that pressure has increased. So, I don't know. I don't know what's going on. They might try to go for it, but I imagine there's also very counter pressure from. I'm sure there's counter pressure from the Russians and the Chinese. Say, hey, don't do this. They don't want to see that happen. They don't want to see nuclear proliferation in the Middle East. But that, just I imagine this gives the Iranians a lot of leverage with the Russians and Chinese. They say, hey, look, we really need to do this. You saw what happened to us. And you can't say, oh, you guys are crazy. You say, yeah, we know. But please don't do it. We're going to help you out in a really big way. This is what we offer you or something. I'm just guessing, but I think, I'm pretty confident that that's what's going on behind the scenes. So it may be that they just use this as, a legitimate leverage. It's not like, they're holding this over, like a madman holding this threat, but it's say, hey, we really need to do this. You understand why we need to have a nuclear weapon. We have to protect ourselves. It's like, we will protect you, and we'll do it in this way. I would be very surprised if those kind of talks are not being conducted right now.
Mm. So you think that this was kind of a wake-up call for China, Russia, and Iran that like, hey, this is a real threat. We really need to work together. I mean, we've been talking about BRICS, but there's always been a little bit of suspicion still between these parties, Russia, China, Iran. Yeah, they're becoming closer and closer together, but we haven't seen that military relationship really form yet. Between these countries. Do you think that this is the wake-up call that will strengthen that military relationship between China, Russia, and Iran?
Yeah, I think so. Of course, there has been a military relationship. For example, in Syria, Iran and Russia worked together. And so that was a big step forward in their cooperation. And then we had a strategic partnership. But we learned that actually didn't extend to the military in a very meaningful way, and that was at the request of the Iranians. The Russians were actually offering it. So this is another issue. It's just kind of Iranian their own sense of pride and independence. They're a fiercely independent people, and so much of the Islamic Revolution was really so, in large part, about that. We are not vassals of any great power. So they are very reluctant to become, to rely on other great powers, even great powers that they now see as friendly, as Russia and China clearly are. But they have to be realistic. You just can't develop everything indigenously, and at least in the short or medium term, you have to accept help, technological and other help from other countries. And I hope that I say it's up to the Iranians, but I would think that the reality of the current situation is probably causing them to set aside some of their prickliness, when it comes to reliance on other powers, and they. But this is something that it's the Iranians' psyche, and we can't make any firm predictions about that.
Yeah, I wonder, will we really know what we won't know really what has been done, what type of military strengthening's been. They'll be doing this in secret. I mean, we were under the assumption that there were at least S-300s, S-400s. People were even saying maybe S-500s in Iran. Right. That Iran had this great air defense from Russia, and we just were working under that assumption. So I was really waiting for this attack. Like, okay, what's going to happen? And then we didn't see the air defense. Then we found out, okay, they didn't have it. So I'm wondering, it'll be the same thing. I imagine that we really won't know what's there until the next attack.
Right.
Do you think that the United States was aware that Iran didn't have S-400?
I imagine that, again, the U.S. has very good satellite intelligence gathering, very good reconnaissance and surveillance. So I imagine they had mapped it out very, very carefully, and that's something that, they provided all that information to the Israelis. So the Israelis in their surprise attack, both from within the territory and without, knew precisely what points to target, and so they obviously did a good amount of damage. We don't know quite how much, but they did a good amount of damage to the air defense system that wasn't as strong as we had assumed. Yeah, we all heard about these reports of Russian air defense and even electronic warfare. equipment being sent there, and maybe a little bit was, but it wasn't anything significant. Again, according to Putin himself, he said that we offered it and they actually refused. Um, so yeah, these are things that happen in the shadows. You're talking about what can how can we know what's going on? Often we don't. We get these leaks, and sometimes they prove to be true, right? But other times they aren't. Maybe sometimes it's just uh, it's rumor and unfounded. And other times it's deliberate misinformation. It's a deliberate misdirection. Intelligence agencies, um, clearly are not really devoted to objective truth and public knowledge, right? They're all about secrecy, and occasionally they do release facts if they believe that it's to their own advantage, but other times they just lie. And I think actually you can see that with Seymour Hersh, who has his sources within the CIA, and sometimes he gets good information. Like, for example, he was one of the people said that the attack would occur on that, during that weekend when it did occur. Or it was going to happen in the next couple of days, and it did. The Operation Rising Lion. I think he was completely right about the Nord Stream. That's held up very well. Uh, um, but occasionally he gets things. Again, there are sources. I'm not saying that he makes things up, but there are sources in the CIA who tell him something, and sometimes it's something that's false. They have their reasons for lying. Um,
Yeah, I'm just thinking if you are the United States and Israel, and we're just talking about this ourselves and realizing that okay, this has been a wake up call for Iran to strengthen military relationship with Russia and China. Russia and China seem to both willing to help Iran out. It was Iran with its own sense of sovereignty rejected the help, but I think that is going to be changing now when they see that they have holes in their defense systems. So I just think if you're the United States, Israel, you got to be realizing that, if you want to attack Iran, it's going to be way more difficult in the future. Do you have a window of opportunity? Is that the way that they
yeah,
might be looking at it? Because it takes a while. Like if there's talk about getting the Su-35s or JC-10s, if all of a sudden Iran has an advanced fighter fleet, that's going to be a problem, right?
yeah.
And then if they have advanced Russian or Chinese integrated air defense systems, then Iran's going to become more untouchable. But this takes time. We
Right.
saw the F-16 program in Ukraine for the Ukrainians. It took years to train pilots, and it never really got off the ground. Never really did anything.
Yeah.
So like, how long would it take air defense systems? 3, 4, 5, 6 months to get them online and
Well,
up and
yeah.
integrated? How does
I
this
think
work?
it
And then
actually
for
to
fighter
have a
jets?
true, yeah, have a fully integrated multi-layer air defense system. I think takes actually years. I imagine you can do it in steps, and you can do things like to protect certain sites. So it's you know in a shorter period of time. Maybe we're just talking about maybe a couple of months. I'm just guessing. Like okay, you can provide air defense just to protect one installation, for example. And that won't take years, but you don't. There's still going to be holes elsewhere, and to actually cover like a large territory, that takes a long, long time. Um, and even and if you're just protecting one installation, that will help. It clearly will, but it it's not as effective as again this integrated multi-layer system, because if you have this integrated multi-layer system, then a missile that is traveling through your airspace has to actually cross through several barriers before it finally gets to the target. And so that greatly reduces its chance of success. If you're just protecting, if you just have air uh, air defense at the site, it helps, but it's not going to it is not going to be successful as again the, it would be much more successful if it was part of integrated within a larger system. So it's going to be, they can do something in the short run, but to really provide that very formidable kind of air defense that Russia already has. That's going to take a while. You can say it's a race against time. Okay, the Iranians probably do need to repair some of their missile launching facilities, and their mobile launchers. Maybe some of those have to be replaced. They need to get some more air defense. Even if it's imperfect, they have to get some kind of air defense. Plug some holes, as soon as possible. But on the Israeli side, what their problem is that they were running out of interceptors and of munitions, the kind of the Hellfires and the Sidewinders that they were firing from the aircraft, and not just them, but the French and the Americans as well. And then the American THAAD stockpile was run down, depleted to a certain extent. The SM-3s fired by the warships, they used up a fair number of those, and the production capacity for those are very, very limited. So so on the Israeli side, and when we're talking about Israeli air defense, it's not just Israel. Again, every missile that got through had to actually, pass through this multinational air defense system that the Israelis had. They had the help again of these other countries, including also Jordan. I didn't even mention Jordan. But it will take them a while to rebuild those stocks. I don't know how long. Again, we know that the production capabilities of the West are very limited, and it may take quite a while. So I think probably quite a bit of work needs to be done on both sides. Now, the Israelis just have to make let's say 2 years from now, it's just like Iran might just be completely untouchable. Right now, if they started again, well, they just don't have any air defense, and that would be a mistake. And it's probably why they called it off, is they were running out of air defense. So maybe the sweet spot will be 2 months from now. I'm just making a wild guess, where, okay, our stocks have been built up to a certain degree, so we can at least fight another week, or, maybe they got to go 3-4 months to be able to fight another 2 weeks. And Iran, we still see a lot of holes in their air defense system. We can do some real damage, so maybe we'll go for it. Maybe they'll go for it in 3 or 4 months. But that's just a kind of calculation that, they have the intelligence. I'm sure that's the kind of calculations that they're making, and we can just make wild guesses from the outside.
Yeah, it just seems like Iran's out of reach for Israel. Like, I know they want it so badly, but that was their one shot. It was at the beginning of that 12-day war, that surprise attack, and they didn't achieve it. And now they're depleted, interceptors. They don't have the defense. They're the ones that asked for the ceasefire. And sure, Iran's got holes to plug, but just as time goes on, every week, Iran's defense is going to be getting better, I think, at a faster rate than Israel, because of the reliance on, U.S. production of interceptors. It's just not there. We can't produce enough. So I just feel like it's out of reach. It's out of reach. And in a couple of years, like you're saying, if these integrated defenses from Russia and China are fully established, then it's done. And then then what will Israel do? Can it be like, okay, do they? It just feels like they have on a one path mind, this one track mind, and they're going to just keep on doing this, even though it's over. It just feel like I just want to shake them, be like, guys, it's done. You can't do this. Just stop, But they won't.
Yeah. No, it's true. I mean, there's just the Israeli mentality is, total defeat of the enemy. It's just like they will feel like they haven't achieved their objective until, the whole Middle East is in ruins and they alone stand. I don't think that's really much of an exaggeration. I mentioned Jabotinsky and the Iron Wall, the Wall of Iron. You see that kind of language. It's always been a part of the Zionist mentality, and it's actually rather than it has grown. It has become like the only mentality. Whereas before there were people, going back a few decades anyway, that did look at, actually took negotiations. I mean, people within Israel that thought, maybe we really can make deals and we can learn to live with these people. There was that point of view. I think maybe it was always a minority point of view, but it's just about gone now, and it's just the wall of iron. Like recently, this you mentioned the Black Flag operation against Yemen. It was the Israeli Defense Minister Israel Katz, that said, like, whoever raises a hand against us, will cut off that hand. There's no resistance. There just has to be abject defeat. Just total subjugation of all these all neighboring countries, all countries within the region, and clearly Iran is still standing, and now Iran is angry, Iran is proud. I think maybe the more important, it's going to take a while to really build up the air defenses. Maybe the more important question is their retaliatory capability. How, to what extent did Israel succeed in destroying their launch facilities and their mobile launchers? Towards the end, we were seeing, there was, we would see maybe 20 missiles at a time. Now, many people theorize that was actually a deliberate choice. They're in there for the long haul, and they figure they just keep on sending out 20 at a time. And maybe that's true. That's what the Iranians were doing. But another possibility is that their launch capabilities had been seriously degraded by the Israelis, especially by Operation Rising Lion in the first couple of days there, the first day in particular. We just don't know. But if they can rebuild that retaliatory capability, and I am not a military engineer, but I'm just guessing that that's something they can do faster. If they have the missiles, and it seems like everybody agrees that they still have a lot of missiles, they really didn't dent that. We can't know that for a fact, but that just seems to be the general consensus from Israel in the West, and from the Iranians too. If they can just rebuild that launch capability, if in fact it was seriously degraded, then even if their air defense is still weak, like maybe it still will be very weak for 2 months from now, and Israel launches an attack, well, they can start retaliating and really make Israel pay the costs. And again, Israel will fail. And if they even suffer even more greatly this time, it will really penetrate the Israeli psyche too.
I feel like it's already has to be penetrated already. Israeli psyche.
Well, maybe they're in a state of denial. It's just funny. Maybe it's also just plain out censorship. They've received guidelines. Be positive about this. We did wonderful. They didn't damage us.
Right, and I think they have their Hasbara machines. Their propaganda organs are going.
But even editorial policies. There's Haaretz will go against the government in a very significant way when it comes, sometimes anyway, to the treatment of the Palestinians. But I don't see any sign of that on Iran. And I think maybe, they may have been just instructed. This happens in the U.S. too with mainstream papers. This is our policy, stick with it. And because I am struck by the absence of any real serious reflection, about what happened to them during that 12-day war.
Yeah. So at this Operation Black Flag, it feels like Israel might be lashing out a bit because they didn't succeed with Iran. I mean, it was during the 12-day war with Iran, that we started getting these daily massacres at the food aid distribution points. Just horrific, people lining up for food, and then they just start getting shot, or tank shells being shot into the crowds. And then we saw an increased amount of bombing in Lebanon. I've been seeing that's starting back up again. We had that Christian village in the West Bank that was burned to the ground, Taipei.
It wasn't actually burned to the ground, but houses
attacked,
were burned.
I guess. Houses.
Right. But other villages have been burned to the ground. I mean, it's the violence in the West Bank is quite severe and continues, and the rate of ethnic cleansing there has clearly accelerated. Again, like I've said many times, if we didn't have all these other disasters, many of them Israeli caused, we'd probably all be talking about the West Bank and the suffering of the people there. But we don't even mention it because it's just so much worse in other places, like Gaza.
Right. So So basically, instead of trying to wind down, Israel's ramping up around the area that it can control. Let's go back to bombing Gaza, go back to bombing Lebanon, terrorizing people in the West Bank, and they're doing this Operation Black Flag against the Houthis. Oh, it sounds like I don't know exactly what's happening, but I'm hearing that they're having some trouble flying over Yemeni airspace. That the Houthis do seem to have some air defense systems that's sort of keeping them from just flying directly over.
Right.
So do you think that this is their strategy, that they, instead of winding down, they're just going to ramp up around the region, continue to do more and more damage to anger people, to maybe try to elicit some type of response from somebody else to give them a justification to try to manufacture consent for this war?
Well, I think it's Netanyahu sees a great advantage, as we said many times, sees a great advantage in being a war president, and that's one reason he wants to continue the war. But I don't think it's just about career; it's his ideological bent. Going back to Jabotinsky, who was actually his Jabotinsky's, I believe, like his deputy. He was the leader of a right-wing Zionist movement, but I believe his deputy was in fact Netanyahu's father. I mean, it's just that this is part of his thinking. It's just that, yeah, the only solution is a military solution. It is total conquest. It has to be just the Arabs have to, all of them, recognize that they are a defeated people. They have to bow their heads and never raise them again. I mean, that's the thinking, and I think that's explains a lot of what's going on. And certainly Netanyahu is supported in that by, especially by his right-wing coalition allies, Smotrich and Ben-Gvir. But there really isn't, there's some opposition in the larger Israeli society, but not much. It's more about like the pace of the attacks and maybe putting the short-term emphasis on getting the hostages home. So that's one reason, we're hearing a lot about a possible ceasefire. Hamas actually, one was offered, Hamas agreed to it, but my understanding is that they actually asked that, first of all, that the IDF, withdraw from at least almost all of Gaza. And then second, that the ceasefire essentially be permanent, or that like a mechanism would be set up to make sure that the Israelis don't, don't renew the war, as soon as they get their 10 hostages. But the Israelis rejected that. So, that's where the debate is within Israeli society. I think there is a majority of people who want to see a ceasefire and want to see the hostages home. But in the long run, there is a consensus that, we must, establish that wall of iron. We must just utterly defeat the Arabs to the extent, again, where they really don't regard the Arabs as fully human. And I'm afraid to say that really applies to the great majority of Jewish Israeli society. Another poll came out, this one actually conducted, I think, by an Israeli university, that showed that, again, 82% of Jewish Israelis think that there is no such thing as an innocent Gazan. So even the children are guilty. Again, that actually just corroborates what that I guess it was a University of Pennsylvania poll found. Slightly different language, but the same thing. Essentially, yeah, we have a right. We should cleanse all of Gaza, and even we have a right to kill them. I mean, that's what that suggests. If that nobody is innocent, including the children, there are no innocents in Gaza. I can't hear you.
Sorry, I had myself muted. I said, yeah, that's just crazy. I feel like one thing that is, it's keeping the peace between Iran, maybe, and Israel, is just that the United States, that there is no support for this war, for the U.S. to be involved in a war with Iran. But I think the goal then is, as long as that's the case, I feel a little bit safe. But I know that we are very good at manufacturing consent. I think you're reading a book right now about manufacturing consent.
Okay, well, okay. The book Manufacturing Consent is a famous book and well worth reading by Noam Chomsky. And there's also another co-author, his name escapes me right now. That appeared back in the 1980s. And yeah, manufacturing consent is actually just like kind of right, getting consent from the public to carry out these operations that the political elite want to carry out. Um, but what I'm reading now is Manufactured Crisis.
Oh,
Yeah, by Gareth Porter, which is about the Iran nuclear program and, as the title suggests, really the lies that have been created, the slander that has been directed against Iran over the years. And it's a fascinating book. I mean, the history is quite extraordinary. I've already drawn from it, and I'll continue to draw from that.
okay. Okay. Well, yeah. So not that book, The Manufactured Crisis, but just manufacturing the consent. I think this is what we have to be wary of, that this is the goal, that there's going to be a lot of work on like, how do we sell this war to the American people? Do you know how we might go about doing that? Or how Israel will go about doing that? Like, what should we
Yeah.
watch out
Well,
for?
obviously, like what the propaganda line so far has all been about the Iranian nuclear program. It's the Iranian nuclear scare. They'll get the bomb and, they'll drop it on New York or something like that. Some sort of suggestion of that, or at least on Tel Aviv. So that's been the approach, and they'll probably try it again. I'm struck by actually how it, obviously works with some people, but in general, it didn't work very well. It sounded too much like the Iraq War and the WMD pretext. So there really wasn't support for our intervention. Now, when this bombing run was carried out, and it was successful to all appearances, at least superficially, there was on the Republican side there was support. It was better than 80% of Republicans actually supported what he did. But that's just a one-off mission. And overall, it was pretty much evenly split and maybe even, negative, which is really amazing because typically, like I've said before, when our boys go out and bomb someplace, everybody collapses. So it already shows that there's resistance, there's skepticism. It's going to be tough. I think it also shows that if you can limit your missions to something like, a single bombing run, you can get away with it and maybe even, get support from your base. And I think that's probably the lesson that Trump took from this. But if it goes, if it's long term, I think that support will drain away very quickly, even from his base. Or if it leads to blockage of the Strait of Hormuz, and apparently the Iranians took the first steps to do that during this 12-day war. And that's something that greatly alarmed Trump. That's why he had his, drill, baby drill, Truth Social post. I think he was thinking, oh my God, what's going to happen? Those are real fears and legitimate fears if we become involved in any significant way, even if in a minor way. We don't, Iran has some cards to play and they could really, really hurt us. So, yeah, it's going to be, these guys are crazy. They'll just go after it. In some ways, they don't even care, it seems like. Even if they do lose the propaganda war, they just may do it. They can win it within, as long as they can convince other elites, the decision makers, including Donald Trump, to do it. It'll happen, but it will, if it does happen, it just won't have the kind of support, popular backing that past military ventures have. So it could, especially if it goes south, it could have real negative repercussions for the administration, but, just for the U.S. government long term.
Yeah, something that I'm afraid about is potential Israeli attacks on the United States as a false flag. I don't know if this is just me being paranoid, but just seeing the way that Israel operates, like what they did with Iran, is just how deeply they penetrated Iranian society. They had all these sleeper cells operating within Iran that they activated for the sneak attack. We saw something similar in Hezbollah. We saw the penetration of the pagers that they used with Hezbollah. We saw something similar in Syria as well, how they were able to bribe government officials and threaten people. They're very involved. So they have all their agents in all these countries. And think about the United States. I'm sure I mean, we have an open border basically, right? So anybody that they do want to put in, if they do want to throw in some type of, ISIS, Mossad agents type of people into this country that they can. And, they'll find some disgruntled Iranians and try to do what they can to trigger something and then blame Iran for this. Like Iran's doing it because that is a lot of the rhetoric that we have is like, there's these plots. Iran is trying to assassinate Donald Trump, and we got to watch out for sleeper cells, Iranian sleeper cells in America. And the reality is, like, I'm worried about Israeli agents, or associated operatives here that would try to do something to frame it as an Iranian. Because just the fact that they're telling people, watch out for Iranian sleeper cells, they're out there. Everybody look out for these Iranians
Right.
in America.
Well, yeah, it's certainly not impossible. Again, as I pointed out before, Israel has a history of using false flags, some major ones, again, like the Levant affair, USS Liberty. But, and yeah, it is conceivable. I think the idea that the Iranians would actually try to assassinate a US president, for example, this is so obviously not in their interest. You can see how cautious Iran is in dealing with the U.S. They do not want to give the Americans any pretext, so why would they do this? This would just be like signing their own death warrant. But the Israelis do have an incentive to make it appear that the Iranians attempted to assassinate or did assassinate a U.S. leader. So yeah, it's possible. I mean, it's certainly possible. And if... Yeah, especially if it may not be necessary. You talk about because Israel has so many actually, public legal assets within the U.S. that they usually get their way. But occasionally, we see with Trump, I think he's unpredictable. He might, especially since he staked his reputation on the success of the B-2 bomber operation. What was that operation called now?
Midnight Hammer.
Midnight Hammer, right. The success of Midnight Hammer. He may be reluctant to say that we need to go in again. He would consider it sort of like an affront to his own dignity and his own sense of importance. It would be a suggestion that his mission was not the most incredible and successful of all time. So he might fight it, for example, even though the people around him are pushing him to launch another strike. And so if it becomes clear that, okay, we can't get him on board, we really need to get the Americans involved in this, yeah, they could. I'm not predicting that it will happen. It's a very risky move on their part. It could be exposed, but you have such a compliant media that even if it happens and then all of a sudden all kinds of questions are raised about, hey, this doesn't seem quite right. It'll be papered over. All the usual suspects are going to be shouting at the top of their lungs. They tried to kill our president or whatever, and enough is enough. We just got to go in and solve this problem once for all. And it'll be those other questions will barely be heard. It's just like, well, wait a second, this conspiracy that you call it, or this attempted assassination, just doesn't add up. That'll be the soft voice. The loud voice is, we have to attack. So, it could happen.
Mm. Well, Netanyahu's in DC right now. It's so sickening that he's here, that this guy that's engaged in a genocide. I don't like to do World War II comparisons because everyone does it, but it just feels like it's like inviting Hitler over and celebrating him. And I feel like that's what history is going to look at when we look back on this, is that we were all these standing ovations we're giving to this genocidal war criminal, inviting him over to our country. It's just, how are we going to live that down?
No, I agree. That was the thought that crossed my mind when the last time he addressed the Congress and he got all those standing ovations, is that, we'll probably looking at, I guess we don't talk about reels anymore. We used to, like when I was young, I saw reels from the Nuremberg rallies and that kind of thing. But yeah, there will be footage of his congressional addresses. That'll be provided in future documentaries. I think that's quite likely. And people would say, "How could that have happened? How could that have happened?"
Yeah. Yeah. I mean, history is written by the victors, but you can't, I feel, but I don't know who the victor is going to be here. I just feel
Well, that's
like,
the scary thing. It's just, nothing the good guys don't always win. But it just seems that to me, as for the reasons that we've laid out time and again, and I think in increasing and more convincing detail, that we are headed on, this empire, this hegemonic world order, and Zionism too, are going to fail. They're on a self-destructive course. It's just a question of time. Will that documentary come out 50 years from now or 10 years from now? I don't know.
yeah. Yeah. Well, maybe you should write that history, Dad. I think so. This is such a fascinating history, and it's so important, and it's important that we get this right in the future. So when we look back on it, yeah, you can write it and do the audio book for it, and then just help everybody go to sleep at night with your voice. Just be doing the world a service. Okay, well, I think we can end it there, Dad, unless there's anything else you want to add.
No, I think that's fine.
Okay, all right. Well, thanks a bunch, Dad. Have a good rest of your day, and I'll talk to you soon.
Okay, bye.
Okay, bye-bye.